Greeting. In this day when humankind has, at last, the power to win the freedom of the universe, astronautics is more than a set of technologies, more even than a magnificent adventure. Spaceflight is potentially the most meaningful thing that has happened since a half-ape first tamed fire or first looked up at the sky and wondered. Incalculable material wealth, knowledge now unimaginable, growth of the spirit beyond all bounds, can be the lot of every man and woman in our future. Is this not worth thinking about, reading about, and hearing about? Instead of a single story dealing with the subject, I have chosen excerpts from several different ones. They do not form a series. They are not perfectly consistent with each other. Yet, taken as a whole, they do sketch a possible history of this race we belong to as it fares forth among the stars. They suggest a very few of the kinds of marvels we may find out there. No doubt the reality is manyfold more wonderful. As a tribute to the late Willie Lay, I would like to begin with a passage from the story called Murphy's Hall. It is supposed to be a daydream, a fantasy in the narrator's head. Nevertheless, it deals with people who actually lived and with an event that actually took place on a very great day. This is a lie, but I wish so much it were not. Pain struck through like lightning. For an instant that went on and on, there was nothing but the fire which hollowed him out and the body's animal terror. Then as he whirled downward, he knew, oh no, must I leave them already? Only a month. Weltall, verweile doch, du bist so schön. The monstrous thunders and whistles became a tone, like a bell struck once which would not stop singing. It filled the jagged darkness, it drowned all else, until it began to die out or to vanish into the endless, century after century. And meanwhile the night deepened and softened until he had peace. But he opened himself again and was in a place long and high. With his not eyes, he saw that 540 doors gave onto black immensities wherein dwelt clouds of light. Some of the clouds were bringing suns to birth. Others, greater and more distant, were made of suns already created and turned in majestic Catherine's wheels. The nearest stars cast out streamers of flame, lances of radiance, and they were diamond, amethyst, emerald, topaz, ruby, and around them swung glints which he knew with his not brain were planets. His not ears heard the thin violence of cosmic ray sleet, the rumble of solar storms, the slow, patient, multiplex pulses of gravitational tides. His not flesh shared the warmth, the blood beat, the mega-years of marvelous life on uncountable worlds. 7 stood waiting. He rose. But you, he stammered without a voice. Welcome, Ed greeted him. Don't be surprised. You were always one of us. They talked quietly until at last Gus reminded them that even here they were not masters of time. Eternity, yes, but not time. Best we move on, he suggested. Uh-huh, Roger said, especially after Murphy took this much trouble on our account. He does not appear to be a bad fellow, Vladimir said. I am not certain, Robert answered, nor am I certain that we ever will find out. But come, friends, the hour is near. 8, they departed the hall and hastened down the star paths. Often the newcomer was tempted to look more closely at something he glimpsed. But he recalled that while the universe was inexhaustible of wonders, it would have only the single moment to which he was being guided. They stood after a while on a great ashen plain. The outlook was as eerily beautiful as he had hoped. No, more, when Earth, a blue serenity swirled white with weather, shone overhead. Earth, whence had come the shape that now climbed down a ladder of fire. Yuri took Constantine by the hand in the Russian way. Thank you, he said through tears, but Constantine bowed in turn very deeply to Willie. And they stood in the long lunar shadows under the high lunar heaven and saw the awkward thing come to rest and heard, Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Although it will be a tremendous experience to seek out new worlds, and those who go will be heroes and heroines to most of the earthbound, still, it will not be easy on the spirit to leave the ancient mother of us all. I have tried to suggest that in this passage, at the opening of the novel Tau Zero. Look, there, rising over the hand of God. Is it? Yes, I think so. Our ship. They were the last to go as Milla's garden was closed. Most of that afternoon they had wandered among the sculptures, he awed and delighted by his first experience of them, she bidding an unspoken farewell to what had been more a part of her life than she had understood until now. They were lucky in the weather when summer was waning. This day on earth had been sunlight, breezes that made leaf shadows dance on the villa walls, a clear sound of fountains. But when the sun went down, the garden seemed abruptly to come still more alive. It was as if the dolphins were tumbling through their waters, Pegasus storming skyward, Falkafilbruder peering after his lost grandson while his horse stumbled in the ford, Orpheus listening, the young sisters embracing in their resurrection, all unheard because this was a single instant perceived, but the time in which these figures actually moved was no less real than the time which carried men. As if they were alive, bound for the stars, and we must stay behind and grow old, Ingrid Lindgren murmured. Charles Raymond stones under a birch tree whose leaves rustled and had begun very faint, looked toward Leonora Christina. Atop its pillar, the hand of God upbearing the genius of man lifted in silhouette against a greenish-blue dusk. Behind it, the tiny rapid star crossed and sank again. "Are you sure that wasn't an ordinary satellite?" Lindgren asked through quietness. "I never expected we'd see—" Raymond cocked a brow at her. "You're the first officer, and you don't know where your own vessel is or what she's doing?" His Swedish had a choppy accent, like most of the languages he spoke, that underlined the sardonicism. "I'm not the navigation officer," she said, defensive. "Also, I put the whole matter out of my mind as much as I can. You should do the same. We'll spend plenty of years with it." She half reached toward him, her tone gentled. "Please, don't spoil this evening." Raymond shrugged. "Pardon me, I didn't mean to." An attendant neared, stopped, and said deferentially, "I am sorry, we must shut the gates now." "Oh." Lindgren started, glanced at her watch, looked over the terraces. They were empty of everything except the life that Carl Milles had shaped into stone and metal 3 centuries ago. Why, it's far past closing time. I hadn't realized." The attendant bowed. "Since my lady and gentleman obviously wished it, I let them alone after the other visitors left." "You know us, then," Lindgren said. "Who does not?" The attendant's gaze admired her. She was tall and well-formed, regular of features, blue eyes set wide, blonde hair bobbed just under the ears. Her civilian garments were more stylish than was common on a space woman. The rich, soft colors and flowing draperies of neo-medieval suited her. Raymond contrasted. He was a stocky, dark, hard-countenanced man who had never bothered to have removed the scar that seamed his brow. His plain tunic and trews might as well have been a uniform. "Thank you for not pestering us," he said, more curt than cordial. "I took for granted you wished freedom from being a celebrity," the attendant replied. "No doubt many others recognized you too, but felt likewise." "You'll find we Swedes are a courteous people," Lindgren smiled at Raymond. "I won't argue that," her companion said. "Nobody can help running into it when you're everywhere in the solar system." He paused. "But then, whoever steers the world had better be polite. The Romans were in their day. Pilate, for instance." The attendant was taken aback at the implied rebuff. Lindgren declared a little sharply, "I said älskvärdig, not artig, courteous, not polite." She offered her hand. "Thank you, sir." "My pleasure, Miss First Officer Lindgren," the attendant answered. "May you have a fortunate voyage and come home safe." "If the voyage is really fortunate," she reminded him, "we will never come home. If we do—" She broke off. He would be in his grave. "Again, I thank you," she said to the little middle-aged man. "Goodbye," she said to the gardens. Raymond exchanged a clasp too and mumbled something. He and Lindgren went out. High walls darkened the nearly deserted pavement beyond. Footfalls sounded hollow. After a minute, the woman remarked, "I do wonder if that was our ship we saw. We're in a high latitude, and not even a Bussard vessel is big and bright enough to shine through sunset glow." "She is when the scoop field webs are extended," Raymond told her, "and she was moved into a skewed orbit yesterday as part of her final tests. They'll take her back to the ecliptic plane before we depart." "Yes, of course, I've seen the program, but I've no reason to remember exactly who is doing what with her at which time, especially when we aren't leaving for another 2 months. Why should you keep track, when I'm simply the constable?" Raymond's mouth bent into a grin. "Let's say that I'm practicing to be a worrywart." She glanced sideways at him. The look became a scrutiny. They had emerged on an esplanade by the water. Across it, Stockholm's lights were kindling one by one as night grew upward among houses and trees. But the channel remained almost mirror-like, and as yet there were few sparks in heaven save Jupiter. You could still see without help. Raymond hunkered down and drew their hard boat in. Bond anchors secured the lines to the concrete. He had obtained a special license to park practically anywhere. An interstellar expedition was that big an event. Lindgren and he had spent the morning in a cruise around the archipelago, a few hours amidst greenness, homes like parts of the islands whereon they grew, sails and gulls and sun glitter across waves. Little of that would exist at Beta Virginis, and none of it in the distances between. Well, men and women will go, regardless. This section, likewise from Tal Zero, shows a little of what awaits them just outside the sky of Earth. Seen from one of the shuttles that brought her crew to her, Leonora Christina resembled a dagger pointed at the stars. Her hull was a conoid, tapering toward the bow. Its burnished smoothness seemed ornamented rather than broken by the exterior fittings. These were locks and hatches, sensors for instruments, housings for the two boats that would make the planet falls, for which she herself was not designed, and the web of the Bassard drive, now folded flat. The base of the conoid was quite broad, since it contained the reaction mass, among other things, but the length was too great for this to be particularly noticeable. At the top of the dagger blade, a structure fanned out which you might have imagined to be the guard of a basket hilt. Its rim supported 8 skeletal cylinders pointing aft. These were the thrust tubes that accelerated the reaction mass backward when the ship moved at merely interplanetary speeds. The basket enclosed their controls and power plant. Beyond this, darker in hue, extended the haft of the dagger, ending finally in an intricate pommel. The latter was the Bassard engine. The rest was shielding against its radiation when it should be activated. Thus Leonora Christina, 7th and youngest of her class. Her outward simplicity was required by the nature of her mission and was as deceptive as a human skin. Inside, she was very nearly as complex and subtle. The time since the basic idea of her was first conceived, in the middle 20th century, had included perhaps 1,000,000 man-years of thought and work directed toward achieving the reality. And some of those men had possessed intellects equal to any that had ever existed. Though practical experience and essential tools had already been gotten when construction was begun upon her, and though technological civilization had reached its fantastic flowering, and finally for a while was not burdened by war or the threat of war, nevertheless her cost was by no means negligible, had indeed provoked widespread complaint. All this to send 50 people to one practically next-door star? Right. That's the size of the universe. It loomed behind her, around her, where she circled Earth. Staring away from sun and planet, you saw a crystal darkness huger than you dared comprehend. It did not appear totally black. There were light reflections within your eyeballs if nowhere else. But it was the final night that our kindly sky holds from us. The stars thronged it, unwinking, their brilliance winter cold. Those sufficiently luminous to be seen from the ground showed their colors clear in space. Steel blue Vega, golden Capella, ember of Betelgeuse. And if you were not trained, the lesser members of the galaxy that had become visible were so many as to drown the familiar constellations. The night was wild with suns, and the Milky Way belted heaven with ice and silver, and the Magellanic clouds were not vague shimmers, but roiling and glowing, and the Andromeda galaxy gleamed sharp across more than 1,000,000 light years, and you felt your soul drowning in those depths, and hastily pulled your vision back to the snug cabin that held you. One hope we dare have is that of finding new worlds to live on, planets unspoiled where humans can make a fresh beginning. Those must, of course, be enough like Earth that we can freely walk about on them. Yet surely there will be many differences, many strangenesses. Here, again from Tal Zero, is one such imaginable scene. On a hill that viewed wide across a beautiful valley, a man stood with his woman. Here was not New Earth. That would have been too much to expect. The river far below them was tint gold with tiny life, and ran through meadows whose many-fronted growth was blue. Trees looked as if they were feathered in shades of the same color, and the wind set some kinds of blossoms in them to chiming. It bore scents which were like cinnamon and iodine and horses, and nothing for which men had a name. On the opposite side lifted stark palisades, black and red, fanged with crags, where flashed the horns of a glacier. Yet the air was warm, and humankind could thrive here. Enormous above river and ridges towered clouds which shone silver in the sun. Steely scaled, with a skirling along its wings, passed overhead one of those creatures called dragons. I think we will never quite understand ourselves until we have met other sentient beings, non-human, and experienced their resemblances to us and their aliennesses. Surely such encounters will stimulate and enlarge our own psyches. Here is a glimpse of an imagined race from the novel The People of the Wind. In it, the Ithrians are winged and carnivorous, almost like intelligent eagles. A group of them has set out on a journey. And the dawn was clear and a tailwind streamed. A trumpet called. Lithran swung from the top of his tower. Folk lifted their wings until the antler-branch slits beneath stood agape, purple from blood under the oxygen-drinking tissues. The wings clapped back down and back on high. The Ithrians thundered off the ground, caught an updraft, and rolled it into formation. Then they flew eastward over the crags. Arinian steered close to Aeth. She flashed him a smile and broke into song. She had a beautiful voice, it could nearly be named soprano, which turned the skirls and gutturals of Plenha into a lilt. What she cataracted forth on the air was a traditional carol, but it was for Arinian because he had rendered it into Anglic, though he always felt that his tricks of language had failed to convey either the rapture or the vision. Light that leaps from a sun still sunken, hails the hunter at hover, washes his wings in molten morning, startles the stars to cover. Blue is the bell of hollow heaven, rung by a risen blowing. Wide lie woodlands and mountain meadows, great and green with their growing. But look, oh look, a red ray struck through tattered mist, a broad-horned buck stands traitor-kissed, the talons crook. Tilt through tumult of wakened wind noise, whining, whickering, whirly, slipped on a slantwise course of currents, ha, but the hunt comes early. Poise on the pinions, take the target, there in the then of swooping, thrust on through by a wind-wild wing-beat, stark the stabber comes stooping. The buck may pose for one short breath before it runs from whistling death. The hammer stuns, the talons close. Broad and bright as the nearing noontide, drawn to dreamily drowsing, shut-eyed in shade he sits now sated. Suddenly sounds hiss of a ghost and gusty, rinsed by the rainfall after. Breezes brawl and their forest fleetness lives in leafage like laughter. Among the trees the branches shout and groan and throw themselves about. It's time to go, the talons ease. Beat from boughs up to roll through rain streams, thickly thudders the thunder. Hail winds harried by lash of lightning roar as they rise from under. Blind in the black of clawing cloud banks, wins he his way though slowly, breaks their barrier, soars in sunlight, high as heaven and holy. The glow slants gold caressingly across and through immensity of silent blue the talons fold. No matter how unlike us they are in every other way, I think non-humans must also know loss and sorrow. Here, from the People of the Wind, is a description of an Ithrian funeral. Before sunrise, Faroon departed Mistwood. That day his home country bore its name well. Fog blew cold, wet, and blinding off the sea. Smokiness prowled the glooms around thick bowls of hammer branch, soaring trunks of lightning rod. Moisture dripped from boughs onto fallen leaves, and where it struck a pool which had formed among the ringed stems of a sword of sorrow, it made a tiny glass chiming. But deeper inland, where old Avalon remained, a boomer tree frightened beasts that might have grazed on it, and this noise rolled beneath the house of Faroon and echoed off the hanging shields of his ancestors. Wings gathered. A trumpet sounded through night. Forth came his sons to meet their chothmates. They carried the body on a litter between them. His uhoths fluttered about, puzzled at his quietness. His widow led the way. Flanking were his daughters, their husbands and grown children, who bore lit torches. Wings beat. The flight cut upward. When it rose past the fog, this was turned to blue-shadowed white under an ice-pale eastern lightning. Westward over sea, the last stars glimmered in royal purple. Still the folk mounted until they were near the top of what unaided flesh could reach. Here the airs whittered thin and chill, but on the rim of a twilight world, the snow peaks of the Weather Mother were kindled by a yet hidden sun. All this while the flight beat north. Daniel Holm and his family, following in heavy garments and breathing masks, saw wings glow across heaven in one tremendous spearhead. They could barely make out the torch flames which streamed at its point as sparks like the waning stars. More clearly came the throb from under those pinions. Apart from that, silence was total. They reached wilderness, a land of crags, boulders, and swift-running streams. There the sons of Faerun stopped. Wings outspread, they hovered on the first faint warmth of morning, their mother before them. Around circled their near kin, and in a wheel the Choth surrounded these, and the sun broke over the mountains. To Faerun came the new wyvern of Mistwood. Once more he blew the horn, and thrice he called the name of the dead. Hor swept by to kiss farewell. Then the wyvern spoke the words of the new faith, which was 2,000 years old. High flew your spirit on many winds, but downward upon you at last came winging God the Hunter. You met him in pride, you fought him well, from you he has honor. Go hence now, that which the talons lift. Be water and leaves, arise in the wind, and spirit be always remembered. His sons tilted the litter. The body fell, and after it the torches. Hor slanted off in the beginning measures of the sky dance. 100 followed her. Even on planets akin to Earth in many ways, we will probably often find things and beings more foreign to us than this. Their effect on us may well be profound exactly because of that. I have tried to suggest as much in a passage which opens the story, The Queen of Air and Darkness. The last glow of the last sunset would linger almost until midwinter. But there would be no more day, and the Northlands rejoiced. Blossoms opened, flamboyance on firethorn trees, steel flowers rising blue from the brock and rain plant that cloaked all hills, shy whiteness of kiss-me-never down in the dales. Flitteries darted among them on iridescent wings. A crownbuck shook his horns and bugled through warmth and flower odors. Between horizons, the sky deepened from purple to sable. Both moons were aloft, nearly full, shining frosty on leaves and molten on waters. The shadows they made were blurred by an aurora, a great blowing curtain of light across half heaven. Behind it, the earliest stars had come out. A boy and a girl sat on Wolan's barrow just under the dolmen it upbore. Their hair, which streamed halfway down their backs, showed startlingly forth, bleached as it was by summer. Their bodies, still dark from that season, merged with earth and bush and rock, for they wore only garlands. He played on a bone flute and she sang. They had lately become lovers. Their age was about 16, but they did not know this, considering themselves outlings and thus indifferent to time, remembering little or nothing of how they had once dwelt in the lands of men. His notes piped cold around her voice. Cast a spell, weave it well of dust and dew and night and you. A brook by the grave mound, carrying moonlight down to a hill-hidden river, answered with its rapids. A flock of hellbats passed black beneath the aurora. A shape came bounding over Cloudmoor. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, but the legs were long and claw-footed, and feathers covered it to the end of a tail and broad wings. The face was half-human, dominated by its eyes. Had Ayoch been able to stand wholly erect, he would have reached to the boy's shoulder. The girl rose. He carries a burden, she said. Her vision was not meant for twilight like that of a Northland creature born, but she had learned how to use every sign her senses gave her. Besides the fact that ordinarily a Pook would fly, there was a heaviness to his haste. And he comes from the south. Excitement jumped in the boy, sudden as a green flame that went across the constellation Lirth. He sped down the mound. Ahoy, Ayoch, he called. Me here, Mistherd. And shadow of a dream, the girl laughed, following. The Pook halted. He breathed louder than the soughing in the growth around him. A smell of bruised yerba lifted where he stood. Well met in winter birth, he whistled. You can help me bring this to Carheddon. He held out what he bore. His eyes were yellow lanterns above. It moved and whimpered. Why, a child, Mistherd said. Even as you were, my son, even as you were. Ho-ho, what a snatch, Ayoch boasted. They were a score in yon camp by Fallowwood, armed, and besides watcher engines, they had big ugly dogs a-prowl while they slept. I came from above, however, having spied on them till I knew that a handful of days dust... The poor thing. Shadow of a dream took the boy and held him to her small breasts. So full of sleep yet, aren't you, little boo? Blindly he sought a nipple. She smiled through the veil of her hair. No, I am still too young and you already too old. But come, when you waken Caedmon under the mountain, you shall feast. Yoa, said Ayoch very softly. She is abroad and has heard and seen. She comes. He crouched down, wings folded. After a moment, Mist-Herd knelt, and then Shadow of a Dream, though she did not let go the child. The queen's tall form blocked off the moons. For a while she regarded the three and their booty. Hill and moor sounds withdrew from their awareness until it seemed they could hear the north lights hiss. At last Ayoch whispered, "Have I done well, Star Mother?" "If you stole a babe from a camp full of engines," said the beautiful voice, "then they were folk out of the far south who may not endure it as meekly as yeomen." "But what can they do, Snowmaker?" the Pook asked. "How can they track us?" Mist-Herd lifted his head and spoke in pride. "Also, now they too have felt the awe of us." "And he is a cuddly dear," Shadow of a Dream said, "and we need more like him, do we not, Lady Sky?" "It had to happen in some twilight," agreed she who stood above. "Take him onward and care for him. By this sign, which she made, is he claimed for the dwellers." Their joy was freed. Ayoch cartwheeled over the ground till he reached a shiverleaf. There he swarmed up the trunk and out on a limb, perched half-hidden by unrestful pale foliage, and crowed. Boy and girl bore the child toward Caedmon at an easy distance, devouring lope, which let him pipe and her sing. Wahai, wahai, way-alalai, wing on the wind, high over heaven, shrilly shrieking, rush with the rain spears, tumble through tumult, drift to the moon-hoard trees and the dream-heavy shadows beneath them, and rock in, be one with the clinking wavelets of lakes where the starbeams drown. Here is a glimpse of a place still more unearthly from the novel World Without Stars. It is a planet of a dim red dwarf sun which lies alone in intergalactic space. Thus natives see the entire galaxy huge in their skies, and some of them make it their deity. God was rising in the west, and this time the sun was down. Only lately, a few clouds were still red above the eastern treetops against purple dusk. But over the hours that light had waned until it was little more than an echo of what now swung above Lake Silence, so that his pale glory stood clear to be adored. The pack could not all make worship. They had met on a ridge near the lairs and howled when the fingers of God's foremost arm glimmered into view. But he would take long to mount so high that his entire self was revealed. The he's must hunt, the she's reek, the youngs gather, lest God's coursers perish. Moreover and worse, the whole pack unmoving here, so distant from their hills, could draw the notice of a down devil out of the sea depths. And night or no, the down devil might then send a war fleet of the herd. If, indeed, that which had lately arrived in fire and thunder was not enemy work itself. Yakila, the one, had brought some bold followers who would go with him to see about that. But first he stood as watch of homage on behalf of the whole folk. Slowly, slowly, God climbed into heaven. Yakila crouched on the back of Crooked Rock and sang. He sang the welcome and the praise and the strength. Then the last coals of sunset went out, and the sky was empty of everything save God, the angels, and 3 planets. And God cast a white glade from the world's edge, down the width of Lake Silence until it was lost among the reeds at this shore. The night was still and cool. A breeze gusted, smelling of damp. A fish leaped in a single clear splash. A wing cried its lonely note. Reeds rustled and were answered by the inland brush. But otherwise, Yakila and God had darkness to themselves. He stopped a while to rest and eat. He was hoarse, the rock was harsh beneath his webs and tail, and weariness dragged at him. Yes, he thought, I grow old, but I am yet the one of the pack. A distant boom made him start. Drums? It was not impossible for the herd to come raiding by night. But it was rare. The down devils feared God, and so their worshippers did too. Only a twihorn off in Umber Swamp, he decided. He looked west again and was astonished to see God's body flame in sight. Why, I must have dozed, he thought in dismay. Does that mean anything other than that I am in truth old? Hastily he went through the invocations and gestures he had missed until he was caught up. The legends haunted him about creatures that had long ago come from the sky and returned, to herd day or pack night, who knew save God and the down devils. Were these unknown newcomers at Balefire Head, whom he must presently seek out, the same ones? More than ever, the world needed shielding against strangeness. I call to thee, we call to thee, thou who castest out the sun, arise, arise, arise. Although I think probably the universe is rich in life, still, there is no denying that most celestial bodies are most likely barren. However, these too have their glories, as we are learning within our own solar system. Here is a scene from the novella Starfog. In the far future, a group of people have landed on a world at the edge of a great star cluster. Yes, yonder is our home sky. The physicist Hern Oren's son spoke slow and hushed. Cosmic interference seethed across his radio voice, nigh drowning it in Lars and Greydahl's earplugs. No, the ranger said, not off there. We're already in it. What? Silvery against rock, the two space-armored figures turned to stare at him. He could not see their expressions behind the faceplates, but he could imagine how astonishment flickered above all. He paused, arranging words in his mind. The star noise in his receivers was like surf and fire. The landscape overwhelmed him. Here was no simple, airless planet. No planet is ever really simple, and this one had a stranger history than most. Eons ago, it was apparently a subjovian, with a cloudy hydrohelium and methane atmosphere and an immense shell of ice and frozen gases around the core. For it orbited its sun at a distance of almost 1.5 billion kilometers, and though that primary was bright, at this remove it could be little more than a spark. Until stellar evolution, hastened, Lore believed, by an abnormal infall of cosmic material, took the star off the main sequence. It swelled, surface cooling to red, but total output growing so monstrous that the inner planets were consumed. On the farther ones, like this, atmosphere fled into space. Ice melted, the world ocean boiled. Each time the pulsations of the sun reached a maximum, more vapor escaped. Now nothing remained except a ball of metal and rock hardly larger than a terrestrial-type globe. As the pressure of the top layers was removed, frightful tectonic forces must have been liberated. Mountains, the younger ones with crags like sharp teeth, the older ones worn by meteorite and thermal erosion, rose from a cratered plain of gloomy stone. Currently at a minimum, but nonetheless immense, a full 7 degrees across, blue core surrounded and dimmed by the tenuous ruddy atmosphere, the sun smoldered aloft. Its furnace light was not the sole illumination. Another star was passing sufficiently near at the time that it showed a perceptible disk. In a stop-down view screen, because no human eye could directly confront that electric cerulean intensity. The outsider was a B8, newborn out of dust and gas, blazing with an intrinsic radiance of 100 sols. Neither one helped in the shadows cast by the pinnacled upthrust which Lore's party was investigating. Flashcasters were necessary. But more was to see overhead, astride the dark. Stars in thousands powdered the sky, brilliant with proximity. And they were the mere fringes of the cluster. It was rising as the planet turned, partly backgrounding and partly following the sun. Lore had never met a sight to compare. For the most part, the individuals he could pick out in that enormous spheroidal cloud of light were themselves red. Long-lived dwarfs, dying giants like the one that brooded over him. But many glistened exuberant golden, emerald, sapphire. Some could not be older than the blue which wandered past and added its own harsh hue to this land. All those stars were studded through a soft glow that pervaded the entire cluster, a nacreous luminosity into which they faded and vanished, the fog wherein his companions had lost their home, but which was a shining beauty to behold. You live in a wonder, Lore said. Greydahl moved toward him. Wait until you reach our world, she said low. Space is eldritch and dangerous, but once on Kirkasant, we will watch the sun go down in the rainbow desert. Suddenly in that thin air night has come, our shimmering star-crowded night, and the auroras dance and whisper above the stark hills. We will see great flying flocks rise from dawn mists over the salt marshes, hear their wings thunder and their voices flute. We will stand on the battlements of A, under the banners of those very knights who long ago rid the land of the firegarms, and watch the folk dance welcome to a new year. Discovery by discovery, we are coming to realize how strange the universe is. No writer now living can do more than hint at this, for we know too little. Nevertheless, I have tried, as in the following passage from Tau Zero. Because of being trapped into traveling almost at the speed of light, so that time aboard was enormously contracted, the spaceship Leonora Christina and her crew have flown through the entire future of the cosmos, until at last it has stopped expanding, has fallen in on itself, and is about to become a new chaos from which it will make a new beginning. Leonora Christina shouted, shuddered, and leaped. Space flamed around her, a firestorm, hydrogen aglow from that supernal sun which was forming at the heart of existence, which burned brighter and brighter as the galaxies rained down into it. The gas hid the central travail behind sheets, banners, and spears of radiance, aurora, flame, lightning. Forces unmeasurably vast tore through and through the atmosphere. Electric, magnetic, gravitational, nuclear fields, shock waves bursting across megaparsecs, tides and currents and cataracts. On the fringes of creation, through billion-year cycles which passed as moments, the ship of man flew. Flew. There was no other word. As far as humanity was concerned, or the most swiftly computing and reacting of machine, she fought a hurricane. But such a hurricane as had not been known since last the stars were melted together and hammered afresh. "Yah!" screamed Len Kay, and rode the ship down the trough of a wave whose crest shook loose a foam of supernovae. The haggard men on the steering bridge with him stared into the screen that had been built for this hour. What raged in it was not reality. Present reality transcended any picturing or understanding, but a display of exterior force fields. It burned and roiled and spewed great sparks and globes. It bellowed in the metal of the ship in flesh and skulls. "Can't you stand any more?" Raymond shouted from his own seat. "Barrios, relieve him." The other jetman shook his head. He was too stunned, too beaten from his previous watch. "Okay." Raymond unharnessed himself. "I'll try. I've handled a lot of different types of craft." No one heard him through the fury around, but all saw him fight across the pitching, whirling deck. He took the auxiliary control chair on the opposite side of Len Kay from Barrios and laid his mouth close to the pilot's ear. "Phase me in." Len Kay nodded. Together their hands moved across the board. They must hold Leonora Christina well away from the growing monoblock, whose radiation would otherwise surely kill them. At the same time, they must stay where the gas was so dense that Tau could continue to decrease for them, turning these final Phoenix giga-years into hours. And they must keep the ship riding safely through a chaos that, did it ever strike her full on, would rip her into nuclear particles. No computers, no instruments, no precedents might guide them. It must be done on instinct and trained reflex. Gradually, Raymond entered the pattern until he could steer it alone. The rhythms of rebirth were wild, but they were there. Ease on starboard. Vector at 9 o'clock low. Now push that thrust. Brake a little here. Don't let her broach. Swing wide of that flame cloud if you can. Thunder brawled. The air was sharp with ozone and cold. The screen blanked. An instant later, every fluoro panel in the ship turned simultaneously ultraviolet and infrared, and blackness plunged down. Those who lay harnessed alone throughout the hull heard invisible lightnings walk the corridors. Those in command bridge, pilot bridge, engine room, who manned the ship, felt a heaviness greater than planets. They could not move nor stop a movement once begun, and then felt a lightness such that their bodies began to shake asunder. And this was a change in inertia itself, in every constant of nature, as space-time matter-energy underwent its ultimate convulsion. For a moment infinitesimal and infinite, men, women, child, ship, and death were one. It passed, so swiftly that they could not tell if it had been. Light came back and outside vision. The storm grew fiercer, but now through it, seen distorted so that they appeared to be blue-white fire drops that broke into sparks as they flew, fountaining off in two huge curving sheets, now came the nascent galaxies. The monoblock had exploded. Creation had begun. Raymond went over to full deceleration. Leonora Christina started slowly to slow, and she flew out into a reborn light. I do quite seriously think that spaceflight is our next evolutionary step. If we do not take it, we are doomed to decay, misery, and eventual extinction here upon Earth, unless we commit racial suicide faster than that. In the outside universe is our hope, And the hope, too, of our mother planet. Consider how much pressure we can take off her. However, nothing is free. Every advance has its cost, which is often bitter. That will remain true in time to come. People will suffer and die in space, and other people who love them will wonder if the gain was worth the price. There has to be an answer which goes beyond the material and invokes the spirit. This last passage is the final chapter of the novel, The Enemy Stars. The North Atlantic rolled in from the west, gray and green and full of thunder. A wind blew white manes up on the waves. Low to the south gleamed the last autumnal daylight, and clouds massed iron-colored in the north, brewing sleet. There, pointed Tamara, that is the place. McLaren slanted his air car earthward. The sky whistled around him. So Dave had come from here. The island was a grim enough rock, harshly ridged. But Dave had spoken of gorse in summer and heather in fall and lichen of many hues. The girl caught McLaren's arm. "I'm afraid, Terangi," she whispered. "I wish you hadn't made me come." "It's all we can do for David," he told her. "The last thing we'll ever be able to do for him." No. In the twilight, he saw how her head lifted. There's never an end. Not really. His child and mine waiting, and at least we can put a little sense into life. "I don't know whether we do or whether we find what was always there," he replied. "Nor do I care greatly. To me, the important thing is that the purpose, order, beauty, spirit, whatever you want to call it, does exist. Here on Earth, yes," she sighed, "a flower or a baby. But then 3 men die beyond the sun, and it so happens the race benefits a little from it. But I keep thinking about all those people who simply die out there, or come back blind, crippled, broken like dry sticks with no living soul the better for it. Why? I've asked it, and there isn't ever an answer. And finally, I think that's because there isn't any why to it in the first place." McLaren set the car down on the beach. He was still on the same search along a different road. He had not come here simply to offer David's father whatever he could, reconciliation at least, and a chance to see David's child now and then in the years left him. McLaren had some obscure feeling that an enlightenment might be found on Skoola. Truly enough, he thought, men went to space as they had gone to sea, and space destroyed them, and still their sons came back. The lure of gain was only a partial answer. Spacemen didn't get any richer than sailors had. Love of adventure, well, in part, in some men, and yet by and large the conquerors of distance had never been romantics. They were workaday folk who lived and died among sober realities. When you asked a man what took him out to the Black Star, he would say he had gone under orders, or that he was getting paid, or that he was curious about it, or any of 100 reasons, which might all be true. And yet was any of them the truth? And why, McLaren wondered, did man, the race, spend youth and blood and treasure and all high hopes upon the sea and the stars? Was it only the outcome of meaningless forces, economics, social pressure, maladjustment, myth, whatever you labeled it? A set of chance-created vectors with the sardonic resultant that man broke himself trying to satisfy needs which could have been more easily and sanely filled at home? If I could get a better answer than that, thought McLaren, I could give it to Tamara and to myself, and then we could bury our dead. He helped her out of the car, and they walked up a path toward the ancient-looking cottage. Light spilled from its windows into a dusk heavy with surf. But they had not quite reached it when the door opened and a man's big form was outlined. "Is that you, Technic McLaren?" he called. "Yes. Captain Magnus Ryerson?" McLaren stepped ahead of Tamara and bowed. "I took the liberty, sir, of bringing a guest with me whom I did not mention when I called." "I can guess," said the tall man. "It's all right, lass. Come in and welcome." As she passed over the uneven floor to a chair, Tamara brushed McLaren and took the opportunity to whisper, "How old he's grown all at once." Magnus Ryerson shut the door again. His hands, ropey with veins, shook a little. He leaned heavily on a cane as he crossed the room and poked up the fire. "Be seated," he said to McLaren. "When I knew you were coming, I ordered some whiskey from the mainland. I hope it's a good make. I drink not, you see, but be free to do so yourself." McLaren looked at the bottle. He didn't recognize the brand. "Thank you," he said. "That's a special favorite of mine." "You've eaten?" asked the old man anxiously. "Yes, thank you, sir." McLaren accepted a glass. Ryerson limped over the floor to give Tamara one. "Can you stay the night? I've some extra beds in the garret from when the fisher lads would come by. They come no more, there's no reason for it now, but I've kept the beds. McLaurin traded a look with Tamara. We would be honored, he said. Magnus Ryerson shuffled to the hob, took the tea kettle, poured himself a cup and raised it. Your health. He sat down in a worn chair by the fire. His hands touched a leather-bound book lying on its arm. There was silence for a while, except that they could all hear the waves boom down on the strand. McLaurin said finally, we came to offer our sympathy. And if there was anything I could tell you, I was there, you know. You're kind. Ryerson groped after a pipe. It is my understanding he conducted himself well. Yes, of course he did. Then that's what matters. I'll think of a few questions later if you give me time. But that was the only important one. McLaurin looked around the room. Through its shadows, he saw pilots' manuals on the shelves, stones and skins and gods brought from beyond the sky. He saw the Syrian binary like twin hells upon darkness, but they were very beautiful. He offered, your son was in your own tradition. Better, I hope, said the old man. There would be little sense to existence did boys have no chance to be more than their fathers. Tamara stood up. But that's what there isn't, she cried all at once. There's no sense. There's just dying and dying and dying. What for? So that we can walk on still another planet, learn still another fact? What have we gained? What have we really done? And why? In your own God's name, what did we do once that he sends our men out there now? She clamped her hands together. They heard how the breath rasped in her. She said at last, I'm sorry, and sat back down. Her fingers twisted blind until McLaurin took them. Magnus Ryerson looked up, and his eyes were not old. He let the surf snarl on the rocks of his home for a while, and then he answered her, for that is our doom and our pride. What? She started. Oh, in English. Tarangi, he means, she said it in interhuman. McLaurin sat quite still. Ryerson opened his book. They have forgotten Kipling now, he said. One day they will remember. For no people live long who offer their young men naught but fatness and security. Tamara, lass, let your son hear this one day. It is his song, too. He is human. The words were unknown to McLaurin, but he listened and thought that in some dark way he understood. We have fed our sea for 1,000 years, and she calls us still unfed, though there's never a wave of all her waves but marks our English dead. We have strawed our best to the weeds' unrest, to the shark and the shearing gull. If blood be the price of admiralty, Lord God, we have paid in full. When Ryerson had finished, McLaurin stood up, folded his hands, and bowed. Sensei, he said, give me your blessing. What? The other man leaned back into shadows, and now he was again entirely old. You could scarcely hear him under the waves outside. You've naught to thank me for, lad. No, you gave me much, said McLaurin. You have told me why men go, and it isn't for nothing. It is because they are men.